under Debbie, climb and maintain 15,000, leaving 3,000.
What you just heard was the last words transmitted on the radios of Trans World Airlines Flight 800. This is one of the highest profile aviation disasters to have ever occurred in the United States. It has been the subject of many conspiracies over the years that we won't be entertaining today, but we will delve into this flight and, with the help of the published report from those who conducted the investigation, unpack the events that led to the devastation that took the lives of 230 people. July 17th, 1996 was much like any other day. For those who worked at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, it was a normal summer Wednesday. JFK Airport was the hub for Trans World Airlines, or TWA for short. TWA is now a long defunct airline, but at one point they were one of the largest air carriers in the United States. The airline competed with the likes of American Airlines and Delta out of JFK. They even had their own dedicated terminal with distinctive 20th century interior design. Like those other airlines, TWA had a selection of transatlantic routes operated by the iconic Boeing 747. The Boeing 747 likely does not need an introduction. It's one of the most recognizable planes to ever fly. The 747 was common at JFK. Not only did TWA operate it, but also a multitude of international carriers too. The Boeing 747, registered as November 93119, was built and rolled off the Boeing production line in 1971. The plane was actually supposed to go to Eastern Airlines, but the order was cancelled, and TWA picked it up instead. TWA operated this aircraft its entire life, and it was the first Dash 100 variant of the type. Even by the 1990s, these older 747s were sort of reaching the end of their life. The accident plane had over 93,000 hours logged in the air across nearly 17,000 total flights. On July 17, 1996, it had flown from Athens, Greece to New York, where it arrived at just after 4:30 p.m. It was then scheduled to fly overnight from New York to Paris as TWA Flight 800, then continuing on to Rome. Up in the upper deck cockpit were 4 pilots. According to the accident report, here is their roll call and where in the cockpit they were sitting. 58-year-old Captain Ralph Kevorkian was sat in the left captain's side seat. He had been working for TWA since 1965. With around 18,800 flight hours to his name, he was one of the most experienced pilots at TWA. Sat next to him in the right-hand seat was another captain, 57-year-old Stephen Snyder, who was the acting commander of the flight. Much like the man sat next to him, he too was highly experienced, with around 17,000 total flight hours logged. Snyder had spent time in a variety of different aircraft during his time at TWA, from the 707 to the Lockheed TriStar, and now the 747. Again, one of the most experienced pilots at the airline. Behind these 2 pilots was the much younger flight engineer, 24-year-old Oliver Crick, who was only hired by the airline on June 22nd of that year, less than 1 month prior to the disaster. With around 2,500 flight hours logged, he was still in training on the 747, with just 30 hours on this plane. As he was still in training, he was flying alongside another flight engineer. 62-year-old Richard Campbell was the eldest member of the crew and was sat in the jump seat. He was supposed to have reached retirement. Whereas he was flying as a first officer beforehand, he chose to continue flying as a flight engineer rather than retire. Curiously, the accident report does not make a mention of his total flight hours, but he did have around 2,400 in the 747. A further 14 crew members were sat elsewhere in the plane, including a whole other flight crew that would have took the plane to Rome after arriving in Paris. In the cabin with 212 passengers for a total of 230 people on board. Ground workers had loaded the plane with around 91 tons of jet fuel, which filled 6 fuel tanks in the plane's wings. There is another fuel tank on the plane, the center tank, which lays beneath the passenger cabin. This fuel tank was not filled up on this occasion, although it did contain a small amount of fuel left behind by the previous flight. Flight 800 was supposed to leave the gate in New York at 7 p.m. that evening. However, the plane was delayed due to a discrepancy in passenger baggage and the obstruction of airport equipment. It would take around 1 hour before the plane would eventually get moving. Flight 800 taxied out to runway 22 right on the northeast side of JFK Airport. At 8:18 p.m., takeoff clearance was given and the 747 left the ground 1 minute later. Following the takeoff, the plane was directed south over the Atlantic Ocean before heading east, somewhat following the coastline of Long Island over the water. The following is an air traffic control recording. The cockpit voice recording was never publicly released, but we do have a transcript that will be referenced later. The pilots were on frequency with controllers in New York and received clearances to climb to higher altitudes as you'd expect, the controller specifying 19,000 feet. As you will hear, there is a lot going on in the recording. This is busy airspace, so there are multiple conversations going on at once. Only the relevant parts will be subtitled.
Lifeguard 800 heavy, 8,200 climbing 11,000.
Disintegration 800, Boston Center, Roger, climb and maintain 13,000.
Space 800 heavy, climb and maintain 13,000.
Delta 76, Boston Center, 124.52.
Delta 76, 2452, good day.
1618, X-ray, Boston Center, 128.75.
2875, 6
Roger.
Good evening, Boston Center, 800, coming up on 9,000 for 11,000.
TWA 900, climb and maintain flight level 190.
190, 900.
TWA 800, what's your rate of climb?
Today's 800 heavy, about 2,000 feet a minute here, and so accelerating out of 10,000.
Roger, sir, climb and maintain flight level 190 and expedite to 15.
Today's 800 heavy, climb and maintain 190 and expedite to 15,000. Okay, you prefer something else?
Soon after, air traffic control would come back amending their clearance for Flight 800 to hold an altitude of 13,000 feet for the time being.
Today's 800, man the altitude maintain 13,000, 13,000 only for now. Today's 800 heavy, okay, stop climb at 13,000. Today's 42, direct and anti.
Other radio transmissions would be made, mostly in relation to a traffic advisory. This would eventually be followed up by an instruction to climb again.
800, you have traffic at 1 o'clock and 7 miles southbound 1,000 foot probably to east 1900. Today's 800 heavy, no contact. Today 900 leaving 15,000 direct and target on course. Out of 15,000 direct and second to the 180, traffic 18. Today 800 climb maintain 15,000. Today's 800 heavy climb and maintain 15,000 leaving 3,000.
This radio message contained the final words from Flight 800 on this particular recording. Directing our attention to the cockpit voice recording transcript, we can see that the captain would make a peculiar observation, quote, "Look at that crazy fuel flow indicator there on number 4. Moments later, the engine thrust was increased as the pilots desired to climb to a higher altitude. Disaster would strike just seconds later. This would probably be a good time to back up and understand what was happening in the underbelly of the plane. As previously mentioned, there is a fuel tank underneath the passenger cabin between the wings. The forward wall of the center fuel tank is known as the front spar. The tank is divided into subsections with separators called spanwise beams. The shape of the tank follows the contours of the plane's outer skin, becoming thinner towards the rear spar. This center fuel tank, just to re-emphasize, was never refueled in New York. It had less than 200 liters of jet fuel in it, amounting to a small puddle of fuel. It is believed that an explosion in this fuel tank is what brought Flight 800 down. So, what caused the explosion? And how could this small amount of jet fuel really be that devastating? The design of the Boeing 747 raised the possibility to investigators that the fuel tank was heated from the air conditioning system that lays underneath this tank. To create a comfortable atmosphere in the cabin, the air conditioning packs draw hot air from the engines to produce the cooler air that is then distributed around the plane. Investigators believe that the fuel that was inside this tank was heated by this air conditioning system to the point it began to vaporize. The air conditioning had been active for over an hour as the plane was delayed in New York. In this gaseous state, the jet fuel is extremely flammable and explosive. As part of the investigation into the disaster, a test flight recreated the conditions inside the center fuel tank, which reached a recorded temperature of around 53 degrees Celsius. For reference, the flash point of jet fuel is around 38 degrees. The fuel tank was effectively converted into a massive bomb that was just waiting to be triggered. Though this explains how the conditions inside the tank were primed for devastation, it does not explain what may have ignited this bomb in stasis. There is no getting around it. This has been the source of a lot of controversy. Here is the theory from the investigation, and it has to do with an electrical discharge that came from inside the fuel tank. As you'd probably expect, spanning the full length of the plane is miles of wiring. A countless number of wires run in the space between the cabin, cargo hold, and fuel tanks. One set of wiring that was of particular interest was in relation to the fuel quantity indication system that tells pilots how much fuel is in a particular tank. It was suspect because the wiring enters the center fuel tank, where it ends at a cylindrical probe called a terminal block. The investigation found that the probe's wiring was in poor condition. Some insulation had been worn away, leaving exposed wires. The wiring that leads to this terminal block runs parallel to countless other wires going to and from the cockpit. Evaluation of recovered wiring from the accident plane revealed that not only the wiring in the fuel tank was in a poor state, but also the wiring generally across the plane had aged poorly, not been replaced, chafing had occurred, insulation worn away, and the inside of some wiring exposed. Given how close together the wiring was around here, the prevailing theory suggests that a high-voltage electrical current at some point from some other unrelated system other than the fuel quantity indication jumped to that wiring through its exposed openings, which then traveled through the FQI system into the fuel tank and to the terminal block, causing a short circuit. This created some sort of electrical discharge with the wiring in the fuel tank, which was already in a worn-out state. A spark or some kind of arcing event then ignited the vaporized fuel in the center tank. This led to the devastating explosion that brought down TWA Flight 800. But before we continue with how this affected the flight in its final moments, we need to understand what evidence the investigation had to support their theory. The culprit electrical current that jumped needed to be of a high voltage. The fuel quantity indication system's voltage was rather low, not enough to arc or create a spark that would ignite the fuel vapor. So where did this rogue signal come from? The investigation very nearly had no evidence to back up this theory. Their evidence did come in the form of electrical signal dropouts indicated in the recorded flight data in the final minutes and leading up to the final seconds from disaster. The cockpit voice recording, or more specifically, the captain's audio channel, momentarily had its electrical signal cut twice before it ended when the explosion took place. For the recording to do this, its electrics need to be cut. The comments about the fuel flow indication also suggested an electrical anomaly. These faults in electrical currents suggested that a short circuit of some kind occurred on Flight 800 immediately before disaster. So, with that said, how did the disaster unfold? The vaporized fuel in the center tank ignited. The subsequent fire caused the internal spanwise beam separating the fuel tank to collapse, spanwise beam number 3 collapsing into the front spar, causing the tank to rupture into the fuselage. In this moment, the underside of the plane was blown outward, greatly damaging the plane's structural integrity. As the inside of the plane was now exposed to the outside, a high amount of stress was placed on the now extremely damaged fuselage skin. A significant fracture began to form in a ring around the fuselage where the explosion occurred. It was a time frame of around 4 seconds after the explosion that the nose section began to separate from the rest of the plane. The nose section would then drop to the ocean below, while the rest of the plane continued in its flight. The uncontrollable fuselage still had lift generated from its connection to the wings, and so naturally pitched up now that its center of gravity had changed following the separation of the nose. It would climb considerably until its lifting energy was exhausted, and it too then fell to the sea. Many eyewitnesses on the ground and water that evening noticed a streak of light ascending into the sky. It is believed that this is what they saw. The burning plane then fell to the ocean, consumed in fire, disintegrating as its altitude decreased, hitting the water moments later.
Lima 3112, New York approach on 132.25.
13225, 3112.
JetX 16 to center maintain 15,000, the Providence altimeter 3004.
I think that was 15,000 with JetX 18, is that correct?
That's correct, thank you.
We just saw an explosion out here, Fancy 507.
Single 507, I'm sorry, I missed it. You're out of 18, did you say something else?
We just saw an explosion there. There's something about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water. I'm under 609 from the front water boat.
TWA 900 for higher contact Boston now on 124.52.
2452, TWA 900.
Thank you.
Boston Virgin 009, I can confirm that out of my 9 o'clock position. We just had an explosion out there about 5 miles away, 6 miles away.
TWA 800, center. Investigate that explosion if you get it that long. TWA 800, center. TWA 800, is the air center ident? Thing will be 507, you reported an explosion, is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir, about 5 miles out, about 11 o'clock here.
Alitalia 609, contact Boston now on 124.52.
124.5, sir, this way of emergency, sir. We just overhead the explosion right overhead this time, 103 miles to JFK. So 48 miles to JFK on 102 radio.
Center for Stinger B 507. We are directly over the site with that airplane or whatever it was just exploded, went into the water.
So 19 miles on the 236 radio, Hampton.
Roger that. Thank you very much, sir. We're investigating that right now. TWA 800 center, TWA 800 for air center ident. TWA 800 center.
I think that was him.
I think so.
God bless him.
Stinger B 507, thanks for that report. New York on 133.05. Good day, sir.
3305, so long, Stinger 507. Anything we can do for you before we go?
Well, I just want to confirm that that you saw the splash in the water approximately 20 southwest of Hampton, is that right?
Yes, sir. It blew up in the air, and then we saw 2 fireballs go down to the water. There's a big small smoke storm coming up from that. Also, there seemed to be a light. I thought it was a landing light on. It was coming right at us at about 15,000 feet or something like that. And I put down my landing light to Yeah, so I saw him, and then it blew.
Roger that, sir. That was the 747 out there. You had a visual on that. Anything else in the area when it happened?
I didn't see anything. It seemed to be alone. I thought I had a landing light on. Maybe it was a fire. I don't know.
I think it'd be 507. Roger that. Anything else comes to your mind, you can use your other radio. Come back to this frequency and tell me about it.
That's all I can think of at this time.
United 2, Boston 124.52.
The disaster of TWA Flight 800 claimed the lives of 230 people, leaving no survivors. It's one of the deadliest air disasters to have ever occurred. The explosion of a fuel tank has happened before. Pan Am Flight 214 also broke up in flight following the explosion of a fuel tank after a lightning strike, killing 81 people. When it comes to TWA Flight 800, it is surrounded in controversy and conspiracy. Simply put, not everyone believes the probable cause for this disaster. Regardless, measures were taken to prevent something like this from ever happening again, including a redesign of the 747 fuel tanks. To reduce the flammability of fuel tanks, the National Transportation Safety Board recommended that planes have a nitrogen safety system installed. The purpose of these is to drown out oxygen in the fuel tank, as nitrogen is inflammable and so it won't cause an explosion. 1996 was a bad year for American aviation. Just 2 months prior to TWA 800, ValueJet Flight 592 crashed in Florida, killing 110 people. That disaster had already sparked outrage in the airline industry. Following Flight 800, laws were passed in the United States that gave the National Transportation Safety Board more responsibilities. Information and services could now be given to support those affected by air disasters, including families of the deceased. Trans World Airlines became defunct in 2001. Older Model 747s have now long exited passenger service. In fact, the 747 as a whole, including its newer models, are slowly disappearing from the skies. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. This one has been a long time coming. It has been the most requested video I've ever had, even more so than Flight 370, which I'm actually hoping I'll get around to doing later this year, but that will also be a pretty big video. In fact, easily even bigger than this video. If you liked this video, be sure to be subscribed as to not miss out on future content. Speaking of content, I am hoping that June will be a pretty big month. There will be another train video coming, hopefully, if things go smoothly with it, alongside an extra video at some point. Anyway, thanks so much to my supporters on Patreon for their amazing support. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name here, a massive thanks to you. All patrons get early access to all new content, 48 hours before it goes out publicly on YouTube. If you want to join and support the channel further, you can do so from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. I shan't make this outro too long, so with all of that said, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I will see you next weekend. Goodbye!